this button. Oh, that works nicely.
Good.
Oh, I'm quite pleased. I may, however, put a little something underneath it just to tip it. In which case, I probably should turn it off while I do that. Or maybe not.
I can supply more stuff if you want it. Oh, I see.
Just tip it a bit. Okay. Well, here we go.
Okay.
This is Ruth Swanson, and I'm sitting with Mr. Roger Kirk, the Honorable Roger Kirk. Today is Wednesday, April 20th, 2011, and we are conducting an interview for SAIS's Oral History Project.
Right.
And before we get started, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your time at SAIS. You've mentioned it to me in the past on the phone, and I want to make sure we capture your affiliation and your experience with SAIS.
Right. I was in SAIS one summer for a summer course, about 6 weeks course, in the summer of 1953. And you want to tell me about the course?
Please.
The reason I was then working in the Air Force, I was doing my military service. I was in Air Force intelligence and working here in Washington on that. And the course was, the seminar was conducted by George Kennan, which is really what attracted me. I had known him in Princeton, elsewhere. And a fellow called Mose Harvey was also and I think another one, is his name Scammon, who was a big guy on population.
Sounds familiar.
Had the course. I was also working full-time, and I was also courting my future wife, so that my attention to the course was somewhat limited. I did attend, and I did the proper papers and all. But I enjoyed it. As I say, my mind was focused on other things as well. That was, as you know, probably it was the time of shortly after Stalin's death, and a lot of maneuvering going on in the Politburo, and part of my job was to try and help people scope that out for intelligence. So that kept me busy.
Interesting. So related to that question, we ask alums how did they come to SAIS, and so you were already in Washington, and this was a course that was to aid you and move you along in your career. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I was working on Soviet affairs. I was interested. I'd spent a year in the Soviet Union before, and going into the Foreign Service, I knew that was going to be a very important field. So when I heard about this course, I can't remember how I heard about it. I think I may have learned it from somebody who knew Kennan, having known him slightly before and worked with him a little bit.
Did you work with him in Russia?
No, my father was ambassador then, which is why I took a year out of Princeton and spent it there.
Oh, interesting.
And then Kennan succeeded my father. But Kennan was at the Institute of Advanced Study when I was at Princeton, and I used to send him copies of Pravda that I got from the embassy, and he did a seminar that I attended.
So interesting. A little background that the viewer of the film won't know is that we're propping up the camera on several books in Russian.
Those I bought in 1949, I think. As you can see, they're fairly primitive printing, but they're collections of the works of various Russian authors.
Wonderful.
I have not read all the way through all of them, I must confess.
So you speak Russian and English. What other languages do you speak?
Well, I can do business in French and German and Italian, and I used to be able to do it in Romanian. Romanian's pretty rusty now.
So while you were at SAIS, are there any memories, any particular events or discussions that happened in the classroom that stand out and have stayed with you?
I'm just trying to think. I know that, Kennan was his usual, informed, interesting self, speculating about where the Soviet Union was going to go. He had come back. No, let me just think of this right now. We're talking 53. So he had come back from being ambassador in Moscow, where it wasn't too successful, really. He, in spite of the fact that I sent him copies of Pravda, and I used to mark where he was denounced by name, which he was fairly often, he was quite shocked at the difference between the time he was there and the time he was in the 40s, when everything was friendly. We were all in the war together, or just after.
Right.
And what it was like and he compared it to a Nazi concentration camp to the press, and then the Soviets booted him out. They wanted to get rid of him anyway.
Right.
But he was not bitter, however. But I'm saying all that because what was my impression? My impression was that he was sort of still trying to mull over just what this all meant and where the Soviet Union was going to go.
Had he written his famous memo at that point?
Oh yes, he wrote that in 47.
Okay.
Wrote that in 47. So he knew that that the Soviets were not friendly to us or had different ambitions than we did, put it that way. But it was just the state of the economy, state of the country, and the police, and their treatment of him that really bugged him. So that was one thing. I also remember that Mose Harvey was a very sort of dynamic, driving fellow with very definite ideas, especially on the economy, not all of which I understood or frankly agreed with, but that's a separate issue. It was interesting, but I would say of marginal benefit, really, for me.
Interesting. So you went on to have, you say your father was ambassador in Russia, but you went on to have your own career in the State Department.
Yeah, I joined. I was, as I say, doing my military service at that time. I was discharged in 55. I joined up the Air Force in 52, did 3 years, off basic and officer training, basic training, officer candidate training. Then came to Washington, as I say, to work as intelligence officer on internal Soviet policy and politics, and then joined the Foreign Service, and for 37 years, and was sent a lot of places.
We'd love to hear a little bit about, although I don't know how one even edits your career. What are the highlights, and what do you think you'll most be remembered for?
Well, in fairness, our first post was Rome. I always kid, I say it was downhill ever after.
Yeah.
We were young, the dollar was strong, wages were cheap, and we had a wonderful time. And then I had a lot of about half my time was in Washington. Came back, and I started out working in the Secretariat, and then came back to Washington and worked actually for counselor of the department, Freddie Reinhardt, subsequent ambassador. And our job, one of our main jobs, there were two of us, was to arrange for Eisenhower's trips abroad. First time a president had traveled with the State Department since Wilson did in Versailles. Because Truman's and Roosevelt's trips during the war were arranged by the military. So I had to try and explain an advanced trip, trying to explain the military to the embassy, and the embassy to the Secret Service to the embassies, and the embassy to the Secret Service, which they have two rather different priorities. That was interesting. And then I went to Moscow in the 60s. That was interesting. And from there to India, which was almost a complete change.
Wow.
And from there to Saigon, that was without my family.
Where in India were you?
We were in Delhi at the embassy. And I was responsible for Indian-Soviet affairs, and then acquired more stuff in Indo-Pak and other things. Well, I forgot to mention that in 56, I was, let's see, 56, that's right, that's before I went to Rome. I was in the Secretariat, the man responsible for the Middle East, and so was very deeply involved in the Suez Canal crisis and all that kind of thing. And was with Dulles when he made his decision to drop the Aswan Dam.
Oh.
The only time I saw him actually leave the room and go, I'm sure, make a phone call to the president just to check it out. But he did say this is a big decision. Anyway, and then after Moscow, Saigon, where the Tet, I was there just in time for the Tet Offensive, which was interesting. And then after Saigon, came back, worked on Vietnam for a couple of years. Fortunately for me, when I went to Saigon, the very end of '67, Tet, as you know, was in early '68, the problem came to be how do we get out, which was much more compatible to me than going in. And that was interesting, the peace talks and all that kind of thing. I'm telling you too much?
No,
Okay.
no, and I would love to hear even more.
Interesting part about that was that in '68 we were trying, at the beginning, we were trying to talk to President Thieu of Vietnam about the kind of concessions that might be made or agreements that might be made if a negotiation proved to be fruitful. And Ambassador Bunker, Ellsworth Bunker, a wonderful New Englander, would go with instructions with his deputy and the political counselor and me as a note taker to talk to Tew, President Tew, and Vice President Key, their foreign minister, and their note taker. And it was fascinating to me to see the straight-laced New England American reading verbatim what I wrote for him from the telegram. It was sort of scary because, the telegram was fairly full, but, you had to make it right. And he would just read it word for word, which is a little daunting because I was still pretty junior. And then to see the contrast between Tew and, between Bunker and Tew, who was a composite Asian. He would talk in a roundabout. You never knew quite what he meant or what he was saying. Also to see the treatment of Key by Tew. Key was a fighter pilot, pro-American, dashing, very different than the man I've just described. And the first meetings went over 2 or 3 months. First month, Tew would be in the office when we came. Then we saw him. You could see that there was a passage to the office, was sort of a translucent curtain. I could see a figure going into Tew's office just before we got in. And then finally, he was out in the waiting room with us. A very clear signal that his power was being substantially reduced. Nobody had ever said, but it was obvious. It was, even the Americans could understand that. I think it was Tew's idea, probably. Anyway, and then back in Vietnam, and then was offered to go off abroad, but at that time our family, we have 4 kids. They were sort of getting to be or were teenagers, and I really wanted to stay.
Right.
And so I took a year at the senior seminar, which was a wonderful year. That's a program since gone, unfortunately, on the theory that people who are going to spend another 15 or 20 years in the Foreign Service should know something about the United States, which is not a bad idea in my view.
Certainly.
And we traveled all over the United States. We interviewed a lot of different kinds of people. My favorite day, I think, was one where we had a Supreme Court justice in the morning and a welfare mother in the afternoon.
Oh, wow.
And I went around the streets of Chicago at night in the back of a police car and that kind of thing. And we got all. It was interesting. And then went to the Arms Control Agency. I was their deputy in their sort of international affairs section. They weren't doing very much, and I came back from a conference in Geneva, and the head of personnel said, Roger, I want to talk to you. He's a friend. I thought, well, yeah, I'll come in a day or two, Arch. When I came, he said, well, I very seldom get good things to do in this job, but you're to be the next ambassador to Somalia. I said, what? I'd never been a political counselor or a counselor of any kind, or a number 2. And I was young, 40, whatever I was, 42, and I couldn't really believe him. And I couldn't think, why Somalia? I wasn't quite sure where it was, to be honest.
Remind me, what year was that?
That was 1972.
Okay.
Well, actually, no, I'm sorry, no, it was 73. Okay. 73. I was 42 because my birthday's in November. It was 73. Anyway, apparently I guess they wanted a token youth or whatever, and I did speak some Italian from my Roman experience. So anyway, we went off to Somalia and spent I'd been there about 12 months. It was, at those days, Somalia was a Soviet-oriented dictatorship. Their language had been written in 1971. 1971.
Wow.
Largely because, they all spoke it, of course, obviously, largely because they couldn't agree what alphabet to use, the Arabic alphabet that the religious people wanted, our kind of alphabet that progressives wanted, and then there was a separate one that had been especially devised for them. And
What's the name of the language they speak?
Somali.
It is Somali. And
when the dictator took over in 1969, what had happened was that we had said there should be an election. In 69, understand, the language wasn't written until 71. And they had, as you can imagine, a chaotic election. 80% of the people were nomads and had no conception of anything. And we had backed the we, the Germans particularly, had sort of backed the police, and the Soviets had backed the army, and the army won the power struggle. So that's why, in my view, the Siad, the dictator of Somalia, was pro-Soviet. Also, actually, the primary factor also was we were very friendly with Ethiopia. The Somalis and Ethiopians don't like each other very much. Well, then, as time went on, during the course of that year, we became, the Soviets became somewhat more influential in Ethiopia, and we became a little enamored of it. And things began, I think, gradually to change. So I sort of thought it'd be kind of interesting to watch that. They had a famine, a bad time, and they were asking aid from everybody else, and I told the department they're going to ask aid from us in spite of our difficult relations. And they did, and to their everlasting credit, the department got a shipload of special food, biscuits there, within, I think, 10 days after we asked. That belonged before anybody else had given anything, so that was very good. Anyway, but I was sitting in my office one day, and a telegram came in saying, this is a copy of a memorandum I have sent to the secretary, and he has approved sending Roger Kirk back to Washington. So I was a little cross about that. And I was then to be the number 2 in the department, in the Bureau of Intelligence Research in the department, which was a good job. Worked for Bill Hyland, who was very close to Kissinger, and for about 2 years, maybe 1.5. And then he was replaced by Hal Saunders, also very close to Kissinger. Hal was a Middle East expert. And I was told that I could have another ambassadorship. We had been away just a year and a half, and kids hadn't done as well as they might have when we were gone. And so I said, no, I really wanted to stay in Washington. So I did for another couple of years. And then I was assigned, told they wanted me to be ambassador in Ethiopia. I said, well, okay. We had been in Addis, and certainly was a lot better than Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. And so I said, all right. But then I got a call from the deputy secretary saying that they had sent out the routine cable to our embassy, and the embassy said, we're sure Roger Kirk is a great guy, but he's just, or a couple of years before, been ambassador to Somalia, the enemy of Ethiopia, and we're just not sure. So he said, Roger, how about Vienna? He said, the music's better. And I said, that sounds fine. And I accepted even without asking my wife, because I knew she would approve. And I was the ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Vienna in those days had 2 ambassadors, one to Vienna, one to the IAEA, and then it acquired another one to the Mutual Balance Force Reduction talks. And then I think another one came at some point off the, in those days, the CSCE, Conference on Security and somewhere or other in Europe. Anyway, so that was a fascinating job, actually. It's very different because it's a UN body. The board of directors was 32, and you had to get votes. Your job was to line up other people, and all kinds of people had votes. And then they had a general conference of 100 and some, and there again you had to line up votes. So I was much more like a congressman, trying to persuade people that what we wanted was conformity with their instructions, which were usually pretty broad. Israel was, credentials were refused for a general conference, and the department said eventually said, we should withdraw from the agency and or suspend our activities at the agency and stop sending them any money, which was almost crippling for that agency. Unless the board of governors, this 32-person board, attested that Israel was a fully participating member of the agency. That was going to be a little difficult because the chair of the board then was the Soviet Union, which didn't recognize Israel, and a member of the board was Libya, which was not too happy about Israel. But we managed to do it through a variety of sort of elliptical phrases that seemed to work. But that was interesting. And then I came back here, not quite knowing what I was going to do, but on the way back I was called in Rome We stopped in Rome on the way back, of course, and asked to be the number 2 in our Bureau of International Organization Affairs. And so I did that. And, well, I guess the most interesting part of that was when they shot down the Korean airline, the Soviets did. Korean airline strayed over Soviet territory and it was shot down.
I remember that. What year was that?
Let's see, I was there from 83 to 85, so it was probably 84. I mean, you could check that. I think it was 84. It was one of those years. And the idea was to, well, it happened, we learned about it on a Saturday, of course. My boss, Harling, or Saunders was somewhere else. And so I was called up to Eagleberger's office, and we had a tape recording, or a day or two later, of the Soviet pilots' exchange. And, you know, we were trying to figure out I guess it was a Friday, it doesn't matter. We were trying to figure out, the department wanted to show that and make a case of why they could not have mistaken it for a military plane at the UN Security Council. That was decided on Saturday, and it was, I think, Monday or Tuesday I had to make the case. And so the question came, who's going to get that ready? European affairs, Far East affairs, or international organization affairs? And after some hesitation, it was decided to give it to us. And so got together a team over the weekend, and they put together, USIA put together a video show. We got the thing organized, and it worked. So that was good. And then, you know, IO, it's just, the interesting thing about IO, International Organizations Bureau, is that it gets involved in things only when they get involved with the United Nations, which means that a given bureau, a geographic bureau, is handling something, and all of a sudden it goes to the UN, and we have to sort of horn in. And that was interesting to sort of work that out in a tactful way. And then I was asked if I would, the interesting thing about that is I was working, the head of that bureau was a political appointee, a former White House staffer, younger than I, a Mormon, a fine fellow, without a college education. And but we got along fine. But then I was asked to go and be ambassador to Romania. And I said, sure. And I remember that 3 of us went up at the same time. Oh, I know. Well, 3 of us went at the same time for the Senate committee hearing. My boss, who was named as ambassador to Sweden, myself, and one other Foreign Service officer, career Foreign Service officer, and a senator, I've forgotten which one, questioned the other Foreign Service officer, and me about our languages, our experience, etc. And then he questioned my boss, Greg Newell, about his. And of course, it was a little embarrassing to be sitting there and to have the great contrast between no college, no languages, no knowledge, and us. But anyway, he did get confirmed. So then I went off to Romania, and that was then run by Ceausescu, a very harsh dictator. Not one that killed many people, but he half-starved his population, so a lot of people died. Couple of impressions from there. Well, let's see. The issue was...
If I could jump
Yes.
in. So when did Ceausescu... He died, isn't that how it
Ceausescu, I went there in 85. Ceausescu was thrown out in December of 89 and had a 15-minute trial and then was shot. Just, I think, almost Christmas Day, or right at that moment. But our policy towards Ceausescu was complicated because we didn't like at all what he was doing internally. But he was less harsh on his Jews than the other East European countries or the Soviet Union. He allowed a certain number of people to emigrate to the United States. And he recognized alone of the Soviet bloc, he recognized West Germany and Israel. and he allowed a naval visit to the United States. All these things seem small, but the point is his foreign policy was somewhat less anti-American and harsh than that of the rest of the Soviet bloc, including the Soviet Union. So each year, the president had to decide whether to extend most favored nation tariff treatment to Romania. And that had to be, he had to decide that, and then it could be suspended or by a vote of either House of Congress. So the issue came up. I would always come back when the department was making its decision to try and influence what they were going to do. The issue was, is his foreign policy and the fact he allows some people to emigrate to the United States, about 200 a year, enough to outweigh his internal oppression? And it was decided for about, I was there from 85 to 89, I think 3 of those years, it was decided to go ahead and extend it. And in Congress, the Jewish lobby worked very effectively to make sure that that was not vetoed by either a House of Congress. So that was an interesting thing.
Now, were your children with you at this time?
No, I'm sorry. The children, let's see. When we went to Somalia, that is in 1973, just our youngest came with us. One girl was already in boarding school, one was going into college, and the other girl entered boarding school that year because in Somalia the only school for foreigners at all was a small international school that had about 6 people in 7th grade and I think none in 8th grade. So they were already out of it. Our son came, spent a year with us in 7th grade, and then came back to boarding school the 2nd year we were there.
And did you send him to boarding school in the United States?
Yes. Yeah. Well, some of them were already there, boarding school at college, and the department, bless them, would pay for that. So that was very helpful. But as I mentioned earlier, they got in various kinds of trouble and things, and that's why I was glad when we came back, and that's why we wanted to really stay.
I can imagine that Romania was just a fascinating place and horrific and interesting all at the same time.
Yes, it was. The Romanians had a saying, this is an average year, worse than last and better than next. And the terrible thing is, it was right. You know, the Ceausescu, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, a year or 2 before I got there, had come in because the economy was in trouble, and had told them what they had to do. And he said, I'm not going to do it. He said, I will pay off my debt simply by restricting things. So he did. Imports even of useful spare parts for machines were not allowed to happen. Food rations were cut down. The economy was tighter and tighter and tighter. And it got so it was very hard. Well, for example, heat was in your home was supposed to be no more than 50 degrees. His office, of course, was in the high 70s. A restriction on the amount of electricity you were supposed to use. I think 1 light bulb per room. If you went to the theater, but if you went to the symphony, the musicians' hands had gloves up to here so they could still finger the thing, and you stayed in your overcoat, of course. The drama, which they're quite good at, and they have some quite good plays. I remember one scene where the husband comes out, his wife is in her boudoir, the husband comes out of his office, or better where it was, and they have a big argument. She's in a deep décolleté with a turtleneck sweater underneath, which diluted the effect somewhat, but poor woman, she had to do that, otherwise she would have frozen to death.
How about food?
Food was very hard, was hard to get. Meat, for example, was seldom found in the stores. And if it was, if you saw a line, it was usually a bone with a little bit of meat, on it. And good for soup, which is a problem in itself because the gas pressure was so low that in order to get enough pressure to boil water, housewife, always was housewives in Romania, would have to get up around 3 or 4 in the morning to cook it. No, there was some meat in the countryside, of course, but you weren't allowed to import anything into Bucharest. You know, because you couldn't bring anything in. And people found all different kinds of ways to do that. I think the best one I heard about was a family went out to a farmer, got him to butcher a pig, took along with him a coffin, put the butchered pig in the coffin, donned their black clothes, came to the border crossing point into Bucharest, weeping and saying that was Aunt Maria. Well, they were let through, and I think they dined off Aunt Maria for the next year. A well-butchered pig will keep a family of, say, 4 in enough meat for a year. And I talked to some Romanians one time who said that in better days, that a person would come to their house in the village and do it, a professional butcher. It would take about a day. And they would have bacon and chops and all those kinds of things for about a year. So it was very tough on the Romanians, and living was hard.
Did you have your own sources?
Yes. We were allowed to import diplomatically. And we would do that. We had a plane would come in from Berlin about every 3 months. We would have to get to unload it, because if the Romanians did, at least half the stuff would be gone. And so some of our stronger young men would go out and unload it, and then I would shut down the embassy about 4:30, and we would put all the stuff would be in the embassy courtyard, and we would all go out, including me, of course, and we would separate it into, there was some for the commissary, and then some, each family could order a limited amount of stuff, and we would pile it into the piles for different families. And then if there was space left in the plane, they would put some fresh fruit in, or fresh vegetables, perishables. And the next morning, Saturday, it was coming on a Friday. On Saturday morning, we'd all convene in the courtyard, and we'd get a number. And the 5 apples would say, number 23, yes! And the 2 bananas, or this and that. And that was it was a good way to do it, and brought everybody together. But we lived right, and we also rewired a number of the apartments people lived in their houses so they could get more electricity. And for the residents and the chancery, we had generators. In fact, I think a couple of the houses we had generators too. And we also trucked in fuel oil. So we were fine. It was sort of sad to see what was going on.
Yeah, that sounds difficult.
Of course, very few Romanians were allowed to associate with us, a certain number, but not a lot. And you always realized that they would report whatever they had to say. But it was interesting. It wasn't easy, but it was interesting. And again, we were allowed to travel all over the country, and I used to do that. I always try and do that if I can. And my wife is a rider, and she belonged to a stable, whose house was about as big. The office, if you will, was a little smaller than this dining room, and she would go out there, sort of in a gypsy area, and she would go out there and ride. So it wasn't a highfalutin thing at all, and it was very useful because she got a picture of Romanian life from the bottom, well, not quite the bottom, but low down, to supplement my picture from on top. And of course, she, in effect, knew a lot more about what was really going on than I did, and it was a very good kind of combination. She was I remember they would run out of things, and we had cigarettes, Marlboro flip-top 100s were currency. I mean, a currency is anything that people assign value to.
Right. Did you smoke?
No, but we bought Marlboro flip-top 100s.
Yeah, I'm thinking it would be very effective not to smoke, otherwise you...
And they brought them in, and they would be very useful in getting anything done. And so occasionally when the stable needed something, she would bring a bottle of whiskey, was also helpful, or some cigarettes. And I remember I thought it was the most amusing. They got some sawdust arranged. And it came in a railroad car. And they got a truck, but they couldn't get anyone to unload it. So she and a bunch of the others went and shoveled sawdust out from the freight car into the truck.
Mm-hmm.
Then she came home, changed clothes, and hosted a fancy lunch. But that's a kind of... And then when I would travel around in Romania, I would ask questions. For example, is there a Catholic church? Oh, no, we have no Catholic churches. I'd check with Betty, who would not go to those meetings. She wandered around town. She said, well, I just went to one. So, you know, it was good that way.
Mm-hmm. Did she ride in other countries?
Yes.
Like
well,
Somalia?
No, Somalia. First of all, we were restricted to 40 kilometers, 25 miles in Somalia. And even more important, there's a lot of, I think it's tsetse fly, and that's very bad for horses. In Moscow, she didn't ride very much, a little bit, not much. We had the children, it was sort of hard. In Rome, she didn't ride really because it was too expensive. And again, small children, she was pregnant and all that kind of stuff. Where else? In Romania, she does, as I mentioned. I guess that's it. Oh, when I went off to Saigon, in India, of course, she rode, and the kids rode. But anyway, so that's. Oh, then I came back from Bucharest and had a job. I was diplomat in residence at Georgetown University, and then at that point our children were married and just starting to have lots of babies. Here, 3 of the 4 kids live here in Washington, or the greater metropolitan area, let's say. And so we decided we did not want to go abroad again. And so then I retired and taught at Georgetown for 5 years and chaired a school board, president of a club, did a bunch of other stuff. So that's a very long, about Roger Kirk and very little about SAIS.
I wish I had more time, and I wish I knew more about these countries and could ask more questions, because it's fascinating. Our final question is advice for today's students of international relations. What do you encourage students seeking a lifetime of engagement in international affairs? What do you encourage them to consider and think about?
Well, what's really happened and changed since I was in it is that you can have a life in international affairs other than the Foreign Service, other than the government. You can do it in law, you can do it in business. And that opens up a lot for young people. I think that the Foreign Service is still a place where good people get interesting jobs. I find, and I'm told by people, that people don't join the Foreign Service now thinking they're going to spend a career there. They join because they're going to spend a few years and see what it's like. I think that's fine. A real problem with the Foreign Service is that so many of the posts are non-family. And we did that in Saigon, and fortunately, it was fine, but it's not easy, and it's not pleasant. Especially if you happen to be fond of your spouse. and also the 2 career families. That's hard to do. But what I would say to somebody is, if you really think you want it, join, try it, and then decide.
Wonderful. I think I have to ask one last question, because it came up with just a simple Google search of Roger Kirk. You, according to these sources, wield considerable power in Washington as a member of the Alibi Club.
Not true. I am a member of the Alibi Club. I'm actually president of the Alibi Club. It's a small club, but we just get together and have a good time together, and have interesting things. Some stupid magazine said, I must have the best Rolodex in town. I'm not that kind of guy. I don't have a Rolodex. So, no.
Well, and it's been in existence for a very long time.
1884.
And so that the history there and the legacy there must be absolutely fascinating.
It's interesting.
Have they had an oral history project?
No.
And will they?
I don't think so. No, we just try and keep a low profile, not for any secrecy reason, just because people like to be able to come and go just in a friendly, quiet way.
Nice. Is there anything I should have asked you?
I don't think so. Not really. You asked me, I think, and got more yak than you really wanted. But No, let me ask you, what are you guys planning to do with all this?
I'll go ahead
history.
and wrap this up then.
Sure,
But
please.
thank you so much for your time, and I'll answer that sort of, as they say, offline.
Certainly.